This is the evolution of project management in a scaled agile environment. This is a presentation and then a book that I wrote in 2018. I've presented this at a few conferences. And when Agile came out, and specifically Scaled Agile, there was a lot of discussion that it would take over project management. We don't need project managers anymore. And this is my perspective on how Agile and project management relate. And I have four hypotheses and myths that I'm going to go through and bust and explain it throughout the presentation. Let me know what you think in comments of this. While this presentation is 6, 7 years old, I think it still applies and the concepts are still very much relevant to today. So let's get into it. And Agile really started out as a delivery methodology. It was around delivering code quicker. And then it evolved into the larger construct, and the scaled agile construct came out in 2015, 2014, something like that. And it encompassed, maybe a little bit later, the entire organization, right? The scaled agile framework, which I actually think is a fantastic framework for delivering upon solutions. But when you first look at it, it doesn't look like there's any project manager roles, and there's not really projects in the framework. And as mentioned in the intro, I plan to demonstrate that project management competencies and concepts are still needed. And I'll talk about my four hypotheses. But so, what is Agile? And I think Agile can be viewed as really in three different ways. One is, as mentioned, it's a delivery method. It's a way of delivering software. There was the manifesto that was done, I don't know, 20 years ago with Scrum teams and introduced sprints and demos and stand-up meetings, all the concepts that we use very commonly today. And, these words are no longer new. Then there was the scaled Agile, which was about having multiple levels of delivery. It applied the principles to entire organizations and sort of decomposed, scoped down with a cadence and a set of ceremonies. And then there's agile principles, and there's several of them. And I'm a big fan of the principles because I think you can still apply them to any kind of project or program, regardless of the delivery method. And this is a version of SAFe. It's probably a little bit old, and I know they've evolved since then. I want to say this was like 4.5 or 5.0, where there's multiple layers. Starting at the bottom, you've got the Scrum teams that aggregate up into agile release trains, that aggregate up into larger solution trains, and then sort of a lightweight portfolio office with shared services that span across. And delivery evolved with Agile. So it became more about the team, right? The team was the center of the model. It was all about maximizing the delivery of the team and minimizing the oversight. There was a flow of information. So sort of scope decomposes down as information aggregates up. There's this whole concept of persistent teams. So rather than just having a particular defined scope, the scope is variable, but you have a persistent team. And then you look to improve the velocity, the throughput of that team over time. Those teams work on a particular cadence, so whether that's sprints or program increments. And then there's not really formal status reporting. It's that you use the tools to gather information. Tools like Jira can be used to sort of, Kanban boards and things like that are used to view work in progress as opposed to a quote unquote status report. And then decision making gets decentralized. And so that has had implications on the functions that we have in project and portfolio management. So as mentioned, instead of a fixed scope, you have a fixed team, and then you're constantly prioritizing the backlog to make sure that you're working on the most impactful items. And without fixed scope, you don't need a formal change control process. It's just about prioritization and then the things like program increments and planning and things like that let you prioritize and sequence the work. Rather than big phase gates to move on, there's demonstrations and acceptance criteria so you don't have to wait to the end to see the deliverable. Financials move from being tied to specific scope to being tied to persistent teams, which actually makes financial tracking way more predictable. Schedule management rather than a giant roadmap. It's more that there's these program increments and these cadences where delivery gets done, and those are really your milestones. And as mentioned, instead of these part-time resources, you've got dedicated and ideally persistent teams, and then businesses involved rather than just early on in requirements and testing. It's constant involvement. So Agile requires dedicated business resources to be successful. And so here's the four hypotheses that I've heard or myths that I want to bust. Is that one, I believe there's still projects. but the definitions of them change. Two, very much so, there still need project management competencies. Third is there still needs to be a portfolio management office. And then fourth, as teased early on, I believe the principles can be applied to anything. So let's go into the first one is that they're still projects, but their definitions change. So if you think about, what are the actual attributes of a project? Right? And PMBOK will say, well, it's got a discrete beginning and an end and a defined scope and, and so on. So let's look at the agile decomposition. And so, as mentioned before, the scope kind of decomposes down, right? You've got these themes that decompose down to portfolio and program epics, which decompose down to features and stories, and there's backlogs in each of these areas that track and manage the work. And then there's these intake processes. So as shown here in a relatively simple view, scope decomposes down into the intake functions, and then prioritization happens, and that's where the backlog is just sort of that living maintenance of the prioritized scope. But as information flows down, or sorry, as scope flows down, information flows up. So the teams report on the user stories, which then aggregate to the features, which aggregate to the solutions, and so on. And this is sort of a view that shows how scope, funding, and schedule all sort of report up. And so if you think about it, and that was a relatively high level overview, you've got a portfolio backlog that has key elements of scope. You've aligned that scope to a company strategy, right? Because otherwise, that's what you're using to prioritize the work. You've aligned to a particular stakeholder owner, right? The product owner that's accountable for the delivery of the work. And therefore, it's sort of a focused initiative which spans multiple teams, multiple iterations, and has a lean business case. And so if you sort of step back, having a defined set of scope, realizing the value and rolling up the information is kind of the definition of a project. So we've worded it differently and you focus a little more on prioritized scope. But at the end of the day, it is a discrete set of scope that you're delivering over a period of time, which is also a project. So the second piece is that, well, with Agile, we don't really need PMs. And I actually think the competencies required to be successful in sort of quote unquote, traditional delivery is exactly the same competencies needed to be successful in Agile delivery. And so let's look at the landscape. So the solutions are increasing in complexity, right? More complex products and solutions and organizations, processes, which then means there's more stakeholders, there's matrix delivery, this concept of self-organizing teams, I say all the time, I mean, they can't do magic. So just saying that you have a self-organizing team doesn't mean that the teams magically know what their interdependencies are, or that solutions magically come together, and or that end-to-end plans magically come together, and changes in prioritization magically cascade to dependent teams. And then third is just human nature, is developers are focused on just cranking out code and not necessarily softer skills. And there are some team members that actually want to be told what to do, and they may not want to be fully autonomous. I believe all of these things means there still needs to be a role that coordinates this complexity, that takes care of the quote unquote magic and integrates with humans and how they interact. And that's sort of what the PMs and program managers are. So the next section, and I won't drain this so much as point out that when you look at each of the roles within Scaled Agile and the competencies required to be successful, the ones in blue are the exact same ones that I would argue are needed to be successful running projects and programs. So, for Scrum Masters, it's facilitation and coordination and driving resolution. It requires a lot of diligence. People think that agile means less diligence, but it actually requires more diligence to stay on top of the moving parts and to facilitate the Kanban and the backlog prioritization and so on. There's negotiation needed. You have to motivate team members. So going up the level, same thing with the product owner. They have to prioritize and sequence the work. They're the ones making decisions, which requires influencing and negotiation. They need to have business acumen to understand the areas of their product. The release train engineers, they still plan the program increments. They coordinate the team delivery. They're driving any of the escalations home, which requires attention to detail. There's a lot of communication and negotiation needed, and they have to lead and motivate the multiple teams that work for them. And then solution trains, right? Getting a little higher. Also planning multiple teams. I think you're getting the point with some of these competencies. And then ultimately at the portfolio level, there's still portfolio planning, a lot of coordination required, facilitation, diligence, and so on. And so this is uh, actually based on a book that I wrote in 2017, where I sort of proposed that successful PMs have, and I had 36 competencies, but they were really organized into four categories. The first is just PM fundamentals, just understanding the fundamentals of how to do PM stuff. So whether that's risk management, scope management, schedule management, and so on. But I'm a big believer in consultative skills. Those are the soft skills around influencing and negotiation and facilitation and so on, given the matrix environment that we work in today. And then you really have to understand the business and the technologies that you work in. So you have to have acumen in both. And so when I mapped it, and I won't go through this, but essentially I point out that, and these are the 36 competencies, the rows across, every one of these maps to the agile roles. And I would argue are the roles that are required to make them successful, as shown in the slides where I listed all the bullets. So here's the only conclusion we can make is that PM type roles are still needed to coordinate the works in the teams. Now, it's not a one-to-one correlation. So it's not I'm a PM today, I'm a Scrum Master tomorrow. I do think it's based on the competencies. So for example, a resource with a strong business orientation might become a product owner, or a strong technical person is probably better as a scrum master to facilitate the sprints and the more technical conversations. Maybe the consultative skills and the people that can manage multiple areas are probably a better fit for a release train engineer or a solution train engineer, or people with good PM fundamentals, maybe the portfolio manager. And so you really have to do an assessment of your team members, because it's not always a good match. But I would propose those that aren't successful in today's environment because they don't have the right competencies are probably not successful in agile as well. So I don't think it's because it's PM versus agile. I think it comes down to the individual competencies. So third is I still believe that there's needed for portfolio management office functions. And so if you think about the sort of the need for a PMO at the corporate level, companies are spending billions of dollars on their investment portfolios, and they're looking for a return on investment. And companies, the competitive landscape is becoming such that are pursuing much more aggressive strategies. Well, they want transparency on how they're doing against those strategies, and there's lots of competing needs, which requires prioritization. At the delivery level, need to focus on value and results. Maturity of delivery is becoming more, which may require less governance and decentralized governance. There's more frequent releases that requires a level of coordination and communication. And now we've moved to persistent teams. We need to know what they're working on. So all of those things suggest the need for a lightweight PMO. So it doesn't need to be sort of a heavy 10-person team, but a lightweight PMO. And so the PMO really moves from a centralized controlling body to a lightweight team, but it still works across the various functions that it always did, whether that's investment planning or high level roadmaps, scope and change management. And again, change management is more around prioritizing the work, driving escalations, managing the budget, and so on. And so what on this slide here, you can see the PMO functions, they evolve. So it's the same functions, but they just require less effort. And so I kind of drew a heat map here that shows the traditional model have sort of moderate to high effort in every category. But in the new scaled agile model, it's much, much less effort. So instead of managing a detailed budget that has thousands of line items in every named resource, now I just have a funded team that's persistent. And so it's easier to manage the financials because I don't have to track down a thousand resources. Same thing with not having a big, robust change control process where everything gets documented, where you're facilitating continuous prioritization and sequencing. So you can see how the functions are still needed, but very much evolve to sort of less effort required. And so, our PMs are bloated, and in order to be lean, we need to put them on the Ozempic approach for making our PMOs more lightweight. And that requires assessing the functions, which starts with inventorying them. What are the functions that the teams are doing? What are the stakeholders and the people working on them? And then inventorying the needs of the organization. So step one is sort of getting your baseline and your level set. Then you analyze the information based on the stakeholder needs. What are the things we should be working on? Focusing on the value and the output of those items, and are there enterprise needs and reports that's needed. Based on that assessment, step three is planning and implementing, which probably means stopping things that aren't needed, maybe transitioning accountabilities to roles that are part of people's jobs. And is there a way to automate and use systems, especially with AI now? There's probably a way to do a lot of the portfolio management functions within AI. And look, it's a continuous process. So step four is more of a cycle of continuing to learn, and how do we reduce governance and administration. And so the fourth hypothesis is that these principles can be applied to project and program management. And so these are the principles. I won't sort of drain through them, but systems thinking, assume variability, um, visualize with sort of and limit work in progress, right? Reducing batch size. So these set of scaled agile principles have been out for decades, right? Decentralizing decision making. I actually have a different book in 2013 around guiding principles of program management, and it is a separate presentation that I strongly encourage watching because I'm a big fan of these. I still think, 15 years later, 12, 14 years later, that these principles very much still apply to program management, and that's diligence in how we get work done, paying attention to the details, trying to keep things simple, providing transparency in the work we're doing, having single sources of truth, making decisions based on facts. I call the ships of professional excellence. So that's ownership, stewardship, and leadership, and then viewing everything in sort of a customer approach. But if you overlay these two, and I won't read them so much as point out that they apply, each of the agile principles, the rows here, can very much apply to each of the program management principles, which are the columns. And so they're very much applicable to program management. And so I don't think it's an or conversation. So I don't think it's project management or agile. I think it's an and conversation, which is program management and agile principles and concepts not only coexist, but they actually make each other more effective. So they sort of build on each other. And you can see here, in this example where project management helps with the scope alignment and scaled agile helps with the decomposition and the prioritization. So now I have a clear value. Or project management brings the rigor around risks and issues, but scaled agile brings the ceremonies to identify them and talk about them early, which leads to earlier identification and better outcomes. And you can go through each of these and see how project management kind of brings the structure and the transparency and the diligence, right? Those guiding principles. But agile brings the more transparency. It brings the cadence, and it brings sort of the ability to recognize things earlier, which lets you course correct or resolve them quicker. And so the model has really moved, though, from the sort of top-down portfolio management, central driving, and each program having their PMO and sort of everything top-down to way more bottom-up, where you have these agile teams that kind of crank out their work, and the lightweight portfolio office helps facilitate the transparency and satisfy some of the more executive level needs. And so here's the summary is Agile's not an excuse. So early on, Agile was like the excuse of why I don't need to do status and why I don't need meetings and why I don't need to tell you what I'm working on. And it's not an excuse. You still need a vision. You still need leadership. You still need diligence. You still need transparency. And so don't use Agile as an excuse for not doing things or not bringing rigor to the work that we do. But if you anchor on the principles, you focus on the principles, and you align sort of coaching to that, I think that's really where the value comes in. So, and the same prescription doesn't work everywhere. So just quoting the agile methods, and I had an example where I had a project and our PI planning was like a 2-day thing. And the agile coach told me, well, PI planning is always 3 days. And she told me it needed to be 3 days because that's the way it was. And so you really got to focus on the value of the things that you're doing. And the coaching needs to be consultative and sort of support the team. But at the end of the day, regardless of the method you take, it's about the people. It's about bringing on the right people and bringing on the people that have the competencies required to be successful. And so, as I mentioned, so let's go back and just revisit those four hypotheses. They're still projects, but their definition changes. And I sort of demonstrated that by showing the scope decomposition that the portfolio epics are pretty much the same thing as projects. There's still a need for competencies because of the complexity, because the self organizing teams is not a magic show, and the scaled agile roles require those competencies. I drained each role and showed you how they aligned. There's still the need for the PMO functions because of the corporate environment, but they need to become more lightweight. And then the agile principles are very much align and actually improve and augment the program management principles. And so if you want to read more, this is the book itself. If you go to lulu.com, I'm really curious about your thoughts on this. I know Agile has evolved since I wrote this presentation, but I think it's still very much applicable today. So thanks for watching today.